Hello everybody, my name is Paul Allen and I'm an independent researcher and author, and I'm here today to talk about Texas Jack Kent, who was a San Antonio, can't call him a native, but he lived here most of his life. So when I saw the convention was the conference was going to be here this year, I knew I had to throw something together about him. I also have a book coming out about him in August. I was hoping it would come out sooner, but timing didn't work out. So I want to talk to you about him today. So first, let's see. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So this is Jack Kent, but I'll tell you a little bit about myself first. So I'm a teacher by profession. I've been in education for 20 years. For the last 10 years, though, I've had this very time-consuming hobby of researching and writing about creative people and their lives and their work. So I've been lucky enough to publish 3 books so far. These are my 3 books. And these all came from something that I sort of loved and was very curious about and wanted to learn more about. So Eleanor Cameron, she was the author of the first book that I could not stop reading. I had to stay up until I finished it. It was called The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet. And so I researched her life and was lucky enough to be able to publish this biography of her. And then next there was this band that when I lived in Minneapolis, I lived there for about 17 years, that I would go see all the time. They were a local band. They got a lot of local press, and it looked like they were gonna blow up and be huge, but then it just fell apart. So I wanted to learn what happened there, and so I started interviewing all the guys about that, and that turned into this book, The Hopefuls, Chasing a Rock and Roll Dream in the Minnesota Music Scene. And then my latest book is a history of Dr. Seuss's, speaking of Dr. Seuss, beginner book series. So the early readers that started with Cat in the Hat and then became this 100 books worth of early readers for kids who are just starting to get their literacy skills going. So I published all those. All these came from when I was a kid. Those were the books I learned to read on. So that's kind of what drove me to research about that. Jack Kent was a little different. But there are 3 things I've loved since as long as I can remember, and those are the Muppets and children's books and comic strips. And Jack Kent didn't have anything to do with the Muppets, but he did do children's books and comic strips. And so, that is a connection there for, there's a background for loving his work. I came across this book in December 2019 at a thrift shop, and I was just looking through the children's books, and I saw this, and I was like, I love these illustrations, they're wonderful. I flipped through the book, and I was like, okay, I'll pay the $1 for this. And then I took it home and read it, and the story was really clever and funny, and I thought, that's what you look for in a children's book, like great illustrations, clever, funny, has a good little message at the end. And I was like, who's this Jack Kent? I want to know more about him. Well, when I started researching, I realized I knew some of his work. So when I was 12 years old, I bought this Mad Magazine special. He had a piece in this called A Mad Look at Sex Education in the Schools. So that was in there. So I had seen his work when I was 12 years old, didn't know, didn't connect it. And then one of the many roles I've done in education is as a reading recovery teacher, which we work with first graders and help them catch up their reading skills. And this was one of the books we used. Jack didn't write it, but he did the pictures, and the pictures in that book are a huge part of the story. It's almost told in comic book form. There's multiple sequences on each page. So I had a connection that I didn't realize I had to Jack Kent. So who was he? Well, so from 1950 to 1965, he had a syndicated comic strip called King Aru, and then after 1968, he started doing children's books. And in that 17-year period, until his death in 1985, he published 60 children's books, 40 of which he wrote himself. So here's King Aru. These are 2 collections that were put out by IDW about 10 years ago of the first 4 years of the strip. When I started reading through these, I loved it, and it learned that it's kind of a cult favorite. people who really know comic strips remember this. This one, it's like absurd. It's this fairy tale kingdom, the tiny little kingdom that King Aru is in charge of. They're always in debt. Their only income is from the frog that lives in the moat around the castle, and he pays rent. Their library had to close down. Their newspaper only has one subscriber. But he told these kind of absurd, funny, lots of puns stories in King Aru, and so he did that, and all the way till 1965. Oops. And then here's his books, some of them. His children's book career, unfortunately, a lot of these books have fallen out of print. This one, I believe, is still in print, and you might see here and there, and The Fat Cat as well. But kids who grew up in 70s, 80s, or probably read one of these at some point. Like checked it out at the school library. Their teacher read it aloud to them. It was in one of their basal readers that they had. So his work was just out there. It hasn't lasted, but that's rare in children's books for an artist's work to stay in print for a long time. So Jack in San Antonio. I want to give you just a quick overview of his life and career as fast as I can here, with a focus on San Antonio and the part it played in his career. So he was actually born in Burlington, Iowa, but his father was a salesman and he sold linoleum, and so they moved very soon after Jack was born. They moved to the Quad Cities, I believe, which is also in Iowa, Illinois, and then to Chicago. And then his father got placed with this 4-state territory of, I believe it was New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, one other state down there, so, and just this huge area. And they just traveled all around as a family. Rather than dad leaving the family, they just kind of traveled around. But eventually they finally settled in Texas. And it wasn't until Jack was, so he was born in 1920. It wasn't until he was 17 that they settled in one place for real, which was San Antonio. And at that point, he dropped out of high school. It was the Great Depression. And he was like, I need to earn money for my family. So he decided to come back on what he loved, which was comic strips. So in his moves, the one thing that was always constant for him was comics. Wherever he goes, there was a newspaper, he collected comics. This is from Us Boys, this is Crazy Cat, George Harriman. George Harriman was Jack Kent's idol, and one thing that Jack did, and if you check out those King Aru sections or collections, there's a biography written by Bruce Canwell, and he goes into a lot of detail about Jack writing his heroes. He would write letters, and he ended up with these correspondences. He was on the Christmas card list of Milton Caniff. Like he would have these great back and forth. He would send them artwork, they would send him artwork back. He asked them all sorts of questions about what it's like to be a cartoonist. And that was his dream, is to have a comic strip. That was his only goal. So he dropped out of high school and decided that he's going to make comics himself. I'm actually going back a little bit, he loved living in Texas so much that he made his own cattle iron brand, designed it and had it registered and everything. They didn't live on a ranch or anything, they lived in an apartment somewhere. But he embraced, like, I'm going to be Texas Jack. And as you can see here, this is a submission he did to Little Abner, where they had a section where readers could send in little ideas, and then Al Cap would draw them, and it was like one panel in the Sunday strip. So here's Jack's that got printed, I believe when he was, this was when he was 17. So it's little kids which choose their nails instead of bread and jelly, as apt as not to suffer a lot with sharp pains in their belly. And it's credited to Texas Jack Kent, San Antonio, Texas. So he had this idea, I could make money off of my comics. Oops. I'm going to skip that other one. And he started doing caricatures. So he would go to the Alamo Plaza and draw caricatures for people. And then that led to him actually drawing caricatures of local businessmen and figures that were printed in the San Antonio Light. And he worked at a printing plant. He did all sorts of different jobs to try to make money for the family. But then he got a job working for Elmer Wagon, was his name. He was an assistant to Elmer Wagon, who was an artist doing a strip called Chief Wahoo. And Chief Wahoo, over the years, turned into Steve Roper and Mike Nomad. Steve Roper was a character that was added in and then took over the strip. Jack only worked on it for a couple of years because World War II hit, and he enlisted in the Army. And he served in the Army for the entirety of World War II. And so that kind of curtailed, he was, on this brink of professional, he was an assistant to a professional, and then the World War II kind of interrupted that. But when he came back, laser focused on becoming a comic strip artist. So this was his first attempt. This is what he submitted to syndicates. It was called Willy Nilly, and it was set in the Southwest. San Antonio played a big part in this. We've got an armadillo and a snake as a main character. We've got this bird from Mexico called Don Pilion, and so he submitted this, and we don't see a lot of strips set in the Southwest. I mean, you could argue that Crazy Cat kind of is, but it's like that it has that kind of background, but they never say really where that county is. So this would have been really innovative, but none of the syndicates wanted to bite on it. So his next step was to try Kingaroo, and that's the one that hit. And so he got a contract for 7 years with McClure Syndicate in 1950 and started working on Kingaroo. You can see he threw some Spanish in there. He did that occasionally. He loved languages, different languages, but you can see throughout his work like this interest in Mexican culture, and the San Antonio's combination of Mexican culture, or incorporation of Mexican culture, was really a part of his work in a lot of places. So I'm going to skip this, but he bought a piece of land with his Army discharge bonus right next to the San Antonio River in the King William district. And once Kingaroo became a syndicated strip and he had some money, he built his own house, and this is a terrible photo, but it's the only one I have of it. But he did it with a Mexican hacienda with a modern twist on it. He designed it himself and then worked with an architect and builders to build it himself. And his son still lives there, and I'm going to get to go see it tomorrow, so I'm really excited about that. So this was the house he built in San Antonio, and he had written into his McClure contract that he would not have to move to New York, that he could stay in San Antonio and do all of his work from here. So that's how much he loved it here, and how much. And I think, doing a little dime store psychology, that he was tired of moving. Like, he had moved so much as a child that he was like, I don't want to go anywhere else. And that had some good effects for him and some bad ones. Let's start with a bad one. So he had an agent with Kingaroo. Her name was Juliette Bridgman, and she was trying to get a Kingaroo TV show going in the beginning. And they fell in love while they were working together, and they got married really quickly. And she lived in New York, and she did not want to move to San Antonio. And the reports kind of conflicted on this when I was doing my research, but either she moved and hated it, or she refused to move. One way or the other, their marriage ended after about a year. So his dedication to San Antonio, either way you cut that, was the reason that marriage ended. They just didn't have the right ambitions that met with each other to be able to make it work. But in the other way, his devotion to San Antonio paid off, because pretty soon after his divorce, the San Antonio Express sent a reporter out to his house, and they were doing a profile on him because he was the local hero, and Kingaroo was just going to be starting to appear in the San Antonio Express. So she did this profile of him, and they had an attraction. Her name is June Kilstock, and he asked her on a date at the end of the interview, and she said yes, and within 6 months they were married. And they were married for the rest of his life. He had a brief betrayal of San Antonio where after their honeymoon they thought that maybe they would settle in Mexico and live there. But her mother got sick and they had to come back, and they ended up staying in San Antonio the rest of their lives. So there they are together, Jack and June. Here, this is an interesting little side thing. His best man was Pat Boyette, who was a local San Antonio celebrity. He was a he was a news anchor, and he did like children's programming and a bunch of different stuff for KENS station here in San Antonio. Well, and after he got out of his broadcasting career, he started drawing comics, and he created the Peacemaker, who, now we have John Cena playing him in movies and TV shows. So yeah, that was just a weird little aside. Is that my 5-minute warning? Okay, all right. I think I'm good. So King-a-Roo didn't do so well after a couple of years. Like, if you think about the comic strips that started in 1950, you got Beetle Bailey and Peanuts and I believe Dennis the Menace. Those took off like within a couple of years and were in like thousands of newspapers by 1953, 54. King-a-Roo kind of stayed steady, like under 1,000. It never grew. And so Jack had to take another job. So he went to work for Ferguson Map Company, which was located here in downtown San Antonio. And this was a little kind of combination of his two things. He made a map of King-a-Roo's, a map of cliches. This is really fun to look at, with all sorts of little puns and play on words in there. But he only ran King-a-Roo from that point on when his contract came up in McClure Syndicate. It only ran in the San Francisco Chronicle from then on. Until about 1962, where Stanley Arnold, who was an editor at the San Francisco Chronicle, decided to make his own syndicate and then bring King-a-Roo out to nationally again, but it didn't catch on. And by 1965, Jack decided he was done. So I'm going to move fast through this next part. He had this kind of middle area where he wasn't doing comic strips and he wasn't doing children's books, but he did cartoons in various places. So he had Saturday Evening Post, Playboy, and then Humpty Dumpty's Magazine for Little Children was really where it turned into him moving toward doing work for children and children's books. And let me go back. So he joined a very small but a very prestigious group of San Antonio children's authors. So this is Jeanette Sebring Lowry, San Antonio native. She started in the 1930s doing children's books. These are some of her more famous ones, but the most famous one I'm betting you all know is this one, The Pokey Little Puppy. So she did that, she wrote that book, Little Golden Book. And then let's see. Another one who came around about just a little bit after Jack was James Marshall. And he was from, he grew up on a farm just outside San Antonio. And he moved out east, but he actually had the idea for George and Martha, which some of you may have heard of, while he was visiting his mother back home in San Antonio. She was watching Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and which has characters named George and Martha, and he had been doodling these hippos, and he's like, I'm going to call them George and Martha. And so San Antonio, that was the birthplace of George and Martha, which he published in 1972, and then led to a long, productive career in children's books for him. Miss Nelson is Missing. He did that series with Harry Allard. And then, so I wanted to say here that Jack and James Marshall actually had worked together in an exhibition in Houston in 1975, and I couldn't find whether either of them actually went to the reception, but I like to think they both did and had a nice little conversation with each other. And then Naomi Shihab Nye is another local, and she was actually neighbors with Jack Kent, and I was able to interview her for my book. And she's another local children's author. She also writes for adults as well, a lot of poetry. So Jack incorporated San Antonio just a tiny bit into his work in children's books. You can't really see it a whole lot. He does have a couple books set in Mexico, which I feel like is a connection there. But this is the most direct connection, this book called The Biggest Shadow in the Zoo, which came out in '81, I believe. And just prior to that, there was an elephant at the San Antonio Zoo. They had a moat around the elephant's enclosure, and he accidentally fell into it. And he was hurt, but he was okay, and came out. His name was Goober. No, Zippy. Zippy was his name. Goober is this elephant. So a little bit later, okay, thank you. A little bit later, Jack writes a book, this book, which is about Goober, who's really proud of his huge shadow. He has the biggest shadow of all the animals. But he freaks out when it falls into the moat. So his, and of course, this is a very Kentian type of thing with a character completely misunderstanding a situation. And the elephants at the San Antonio Zoo also gave rides, which Jack did with this elephant. So there's a brief San Antonio connection. And then he was a regular at a bookshop, which sadly is not there anymore, but had been there for about 50 years, called Rosengrens in downtown San Antonio. And he was great friends with this was the owner, and then the daughter. So Florence was her name, and then Cammy and his nickname was Figgy. They were the owners and ran the store, and they always had him in for like book signings when he had new books out. And he had a huge collection of books himself, so he was a regular shopper. And then this is John Igo, who was a professor here at San Antonio College, I believe, and he was a regular at the bookstore, and he was friends with Jack. Jack dedicated 4 different books to these people throughout his career. So he was really part of the San Antonio literary community, even though by nature he was sort of a stay-at-home and work hermit type of person. So he died in 1985. He was fairly young, he was only in his 60s. But Jack left behind this great legacy of these books that really come from inside, and that's what I really connected with, especially with his children's book work, is that he wrote about himself, and I love this. This was in one of the last things he did. Okay, and I'll just read this and then I'll be done. So he says, it's fun to write a story. Getting the idea is the hard thing, but everything I ever did or saw or heard or felt has an idea in it. So all I have to do is look about in my head, and in time I find an idea to share with you. And I love that. And that's a really good summary of his career. So my book's coming out this August. Thank you all for listening. I got bookmarks I'll hand out later, and I'll be glad to answer any questions at the end. Thank you all.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
She set up.